So these are the first times that I heard music in video games and anime, and I thought, I want to do that. How do I write music for video games and anime? So I have a few different examples of this. Number one, the first one I can remember for sure is in Pokemon. Red, blue, gold, silver, like the first two generations. I mean, I was little, like a kid during those, and I remember always I learned to whistle because of those games. I didn't know how to whistle, and the tunes were so catchy. They were a little repetitive because they couldn't fit like a lot of uh, space on the games for like a ton of music or long music. So it was just like these catchy little melodies. Nintendo was always good about that. Um, and a lot of Japanese musicians are good about that as well. Hence the Japanese composer for the game. But that was one of the first times. Now, I'm not sure if that was specifically the first time I thought I want to write music for video games because at the time I didn't even play music yet. I didn't know how to play guitar or anything. I think that probably came around the days of PlayStation where I had. It was a little bit after PlayStation, but the games I can think of would be like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX. And definitely the biggest one I would say would be Chrono Cross. So if you haven't heard of Chrono Cross, it's the sequel. It's not really a sequel. I won't spoil it, but it's a second game after Chrono Trigger, which was on the Super Nintendo. So the thing about Final Fantasy and Chrono Cross specifically is it had this crazy music. I'll talk about Chrono Cross. The music was like very otherworldly. And what I mean by that is it was like, of course, they had a story behind this world that they made up. And the music was sort of like a mix of cultures. You know, it had like this sort of Japanese sound to it, but it incorporate the different synths and orchestral instruments and instruments from different cultures, right? Like the sitar or different like tribal drums or like Celtic, like Irish music. So it's like Japanese and Celtic and all these other influences. And it was so cool. I hadn't really realized that about music yet until around that point. I was like, whoa, like they're creating this crazy world here just with music to emotionally back up and create this really intense experience for the player. And that was the sound part. Of course, the game was great as well. The story and the world that they built. And you see that a lot in video game music. So that was the first time I realized that. And then once I finally got a hold of a guitar, I started learning some of that music. It was like some AC/DC, Nirvana, like Blink-182, stuff like that. And then also it was like Final Fantasy and Pokemon and Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, like the games like those. And for anime, it's hard because I didn't get into anime until later. But I'll give you an example of why it crossed over into me like playing into bands and then being like, wait a minute, maybe I could write music for video games and anime. So there's two key soundtracks here. So one was a video game called Sonic Adventure 2. That was on Dreamcast, Sega, and then Nintendo GameCube. So the reason I started to think this is because I played guitar and I played in bands, and Sonic Adventure 2 had sort of like a modern soundtrack. It wasn't like old school sounding, like 8-bit or chiptune, and it wasn't orchestral sounding. Like it didn't sound like an old video game, and it didn't sound like orchestra stuff like Final Fantasy. So I was like, what is going on here? I didn't even think you could do that. It turns out Sega has a lot of really like hip and modern soundtracks as well. Like Jet Set Radio had a really cool like, it was like breakbeat and not like hip hop exactly, but it was like a rollerblading game with graffiti. Like they were like graffitiing buildings and grinding on rails and stuff like that, and this cool break dance. Like I don't know how to explain it exactly, but they tried to do like this sort of like futuristic vibe to it. Is super cool. Um, but back to Sonic Adventure 2, there was like this cool like Japanese. I don't know how to explain it. Like it was like a rock guitarist who wrote a bunch of music for a video game. So it's unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Like these cool harmonies, like two guitars playing together, and like these weird synths and things like that, and even some hip hop and other like jazz in there too. Super cool soundtrack. And by the way, Sonic 3 just came out in theaters the other day, which is inspired by Sonic Adventure 2. So if you haven't watched the other movies, maybe go watch them or play that game. Now, on the anime side, same exact reason. I was a rock guitarist playing in bands, and yes, there are other great anime soundtracks that I figured out about later. But the one I'll talk about for now, obviously, was like my starter anime was being a kid in America, Cartoon Network seeing Toonami. So you probably guess what I'm gonna say. It's Dragon Ball Z. And the reason I say that is because Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z's Japanese soundtrack have more orchestral and Japanese sounding elements to it, while the English soundtrack was different. Which, by the way, a lot of games in anime don't have a different soundtrack for Japan and the US. It's the same soundtrack. So that was kind of cool. And the English soundtrack had a lot of rock influence as well, like a lot of sort of like guitar leads and solos and cool weird synth stuff, and like it sounds like a band sometimes doing the soundtrack. So that's exactly what got me into it. It's like, whoa, this is like really unconventional, because everyone's used to your like John Williams, your orchestral this and that, your normal like trailer music dubstep drops, right? Or chip tune, like the old school video game sounds. But this was like sort of spearheading like a different sound completely, and it made you realize like, oh, like video games can sound like anything, and you just have to be creative and come up with a cool sound palette. It's like a painter's palette, or like the way that they paint something, but for sound, which I thought was amazing, and that's what got me into it. So if you get the chance, I'll list them back again so you can go check them out. I highly recommend that you go listen to, let's say, some of the Pokemon Gold or Silver soundtrack. And I also recommend you go check out, let's say, Sonic Adventure 2 and Dragon Ball Z, English and Japanese soundtracks. I would recommend you check out, I didn't mention this in the video, but like Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. That's a great soundtrack as well. Go check that out. Jet Set Radio. That's an amazing one too. And then also, there's another one I mentioned. Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX, and Chrono Cross. Chrono Trigger as well. It all has amazing music, and you can see why. It's just so like emotionally packed. Like it's got a lot of energy behind it. Cool sounds, cool melodies. It'll get stuck in your head. And I mean, maybe it's just me, right? I know there's other people that are passionate about it. Maybe not as passionate about a musician who is also a video game and anime composer. But you can see like how much I love this stuff. And I'm sure there are other people that have a similar love for these shows or games or the music as well. So if you're a fan of any of these things, go check them out. That's enough out of me. If you can, it's free to subscribe to the channel. I'm close to 1,000 subscribers, and I'm in a tough financial position actually. So it would mean the world to me if you could subscribe. It's free. Once I hit 1,000 subscribers, I can monetize the channel, and I can start doing live streams as well, which will make it easier to make a living off of YouTube too. So that'll be another part of this, outside of the music and getting myself off the ground. So, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll share more with you about my journey here in the next video. Peace.